Hey guys, what is up? Public here, back with another video. And today, first video of 10.05, really, I want to go over talents. So this is kind of the biggest thing people are changing and kind of working with this patch. So I want to go over all the builds that you need to know and care about as the Shadow Priest in 10.05. Let's dig in. Okay, so 10.05 and the kind of recent balancing changes have kind of altered our builds quite heavily from an AoE perspective, although things like single target nature really didn't change much or hardly at all. So that will be somewhat normal if you haven't been paying attention up until now. But if you're just getting into Shadow Priest, this should be helpful as well. So I'm going to go over the builds that I'm currently using as a kind of a caveat in, Icy Veins guides or in the Discord, and it'll be in the description as well. There's a giant list of just all the talents strings that you could need as a Shadow Priest. You can just easily copy and paste them into your in-game calculator. Now that being said, I do kind of go a little overboard with that in the sense that if you want to kind of hyper optimize for a given situation, I have more builds than you probably need. And honestly, these are the kind of builds that I run on my Shadow Priest, right? So I don't have 15,000 builds. I only run with these basically. And I do some minor tweaks here and there to kind of fit what I want on that fight. But I'm going to kind of show what I use as kind of my base builds, and hopefully that will help you out. So to start off here, this is our single target talent tree, the kind of bread and butter default stuff. Specifically, a lot of this is going to be concerning the spec tree. This is kind of mainly what we're going for here. And I use this mainly for things like Taros or even Razaget, depending on kind of what I want. Or if I'm just out in the open world, or if I'm doing like heroic re-clears and I don't care about padding on ads because they won't live as long. This is usually what I run here. This is kind of the standard build with Idol Visharge and Cthulhu. Now, there are some audibles that you can make with this build, and you can see I already have a few of them in here. So one of them is, you can see I've dropped Silence to pick up Mindseer. Obviously, this is quite fight dependent, but depending on what you're doing, if the fight is mostly single target, but they have like random ads being thrown in, they don't live very long, so you don't want to spec too much into AoE. So things like Aranog, when the ads are just getting blasted, it's not always worth it to kind of save damage for the ads in that case, because they just don't live very long. Sometimes, depending on your group, like Razaget ads have a similar problem where it's like, well, I do kind of want Mindseer, but I still want the single target build, and this is usually the trade-off that I do for that. But you can just easily pick up Silence, drop Mindseer. That's the kind of standard that you would see there. Now, the kind of other option that you have here that does pretty equivalent single target damage is to pick up Idol of Yogg-Saron. So specifically, there is kind of like, a couple different reasons for this. One of them being Idol of Yogg-Saron does let you get Mind Devour instead of Screams of the Void. So what that looks like is you literally just swap those 3 points right there, and then you run Visharge, Yogg-Saron. Everything else is exactly the same in this. For the most part, in terms of like sim damage and log damage, these builds are very, very close together, almost indistinguishable. So it's kind of more on kind of preference more than anything. The biggest difference with this build kind of rotationally is that you do press Mind Spike as your default filler with this, whereas if you're taking Cthulhu, your default filler is Mind Flay, right, to get more Screams and Cthulhu procs. Or, obviously it's averaged out, but, that's the kind of base filler differences. You go Mind Spike filler with this because you don't have Cthulhu, you have Mind Melt, and you don't have Mental Decay. Now it's kind of a complex mess with what you do with your filler spells. But you do get those Mind Devour procs, which if you are fighting and this is kind of nice for any fight, and there's quite a lot of them that does have kind of random spattering of ads, where getting those random Mindseer procs could be kind of nice. In terms of movement, I don't actually think there's too big of a difference between the two builds. Obviously, Mind Devour does give you some procs that you can use on Devouring Plague Instant to get another proc while moving. I don't think that's super valuable, super necessary, so I think it's mostly preference when it comes to these builds. Now that being said, if you decide for whatever reason that you want to get some more Cleave, this is kind of where I run to my second build. So this is single target plus Cleave. You can see it swaps those 3 points over. The other audible that you can make when you're in this mode is to pick up Psychic Link. So Psychic Link was recently changed to affect more spells, if you didn't know. So Mind Blast, Mind Flay, Spike have all been there. They've now added Mind Games, Void Bolt, and Void Torrent. Part of the reason why we take this guy quite basically all the time. If you're in that situation and you want to say, you know, I don't like calling it pad because obviously they need to die, but, you know, Aranog, Dathia platforms, Senarth spiders, Razageth platform ads, like all these kinds of situations where you would like to lose some single target damage to do more ad damage, and sometimes it is worth to do. It just kind of depends on the situation. What you do here is you drop these points in Dark Evangelism. Oh, you can see I messed that up. So you come over here, you drop these points into Dark Evangelism, and then you put them into Psychic Link instead. And this is kind of the audible here, where you can choose Dark Evangelism for more or less more single target. It does have some AoE value, but mostly single target. And you get Psychic Link instead. Gives you way more Cleave AoE, way less reliant on Insanity and Mindseer procs to be able to do AoE damage. Can be really nice for those. So kind of an audible, like I said, for a lot of like progression fights. I don't know if I'd advocate for that. It just kind of depends on what your group needs. Like Senarth, for example, Psychic Link is kind of pad. For the most part, again, kind of depends on what you want, what your group needs, and if you're trying to parse or if you're just trying to prog and kill the boss. So keep that in mind. That's what that's there for. So yeah, this is the kind of single target with Cleave build that I run, and this can be run, like I said, on basically any boss where you care about boss damage and there are ads coming out that are frequent. So this is quite a lot of them. Like I said, Aranog, Dathia, Senarth, all fall into this category. Broodkeeper to a certain extent. If you don't want to go full into ads, this can be a good setup, and then even Razageth as well. So those are the two main kind of single target focus builds. So moving on to the next one, let's cover the kind of odd bosses, which is Council and Kurog. So Council is our kind of standard 4-target talent setup. So this is where we swap from Dark Ascension to Void Eruption, and instead we now pick up Idol of N'Zoth and Yogg-Saron. This is more or less kind of a newer thing with 10.05, just with the power of Void Torrent Malediction. Cleaving with Psychic Link is a pretty, standard build, and you don't really press your fillers very often as well. You never press Devouring Plague on 4 targets. It's all just Mindseer damage. So yeah, pretty standard stuff. Now the trick here is kind of with your fillers, you can more or less, you can spike if you want, you can flay if you want. I would say for the most part, this is a spike filler build. You are taking Mental Decay, but generally speaking, your Mind Sears will be enough to sustain your dots. You don't need to Mind Flay. That'll just be awkward. So this is a spike filler build. If you don't like that, well, that's how we get down here. So that's what we do. And this just does a lot of damage when 4 targets. It's not something you'd run outside of that. Mythic Plus, I mean, kind of. It has some things here that would it's close to some Mythic Plus builds, but we would want to pick up Mind Flay Insanity for that. But yeah, this is my 4-target build. I only use it for Council. I think I got over 200k on one parse. I forget which one, if it was Heroic or Mythic. But yeah, you can get pretty big numbers with this. You're already seeing Shadow Priest, Eclipse, Boomkins, and things like that, which is good to see on this fight. So yeah, really positive build. And this is kind of the Council setup. Okay, moving on to Kurog. So Kurog is the weird one. This is weird because the fight is one of the more substantial changes from Heroic to Mythic, or normal Heroic to Mythic, whatever kind of difficulty curve that you're at. On Mythic, this fight is much more 2-target than it is otherwise. So this is kind of the choice you get to make of kind of where you want to optimize your damage. Because it is a lot more 2-target, it's not all of the fight, but it is quite a substantial amount of it. The caveat there is, though, while killing the ads is very important in both intermission phases and in the first 2 kind of P1 phases, when you're at the end phase, you typically don't kill that last ad. You're just focusing the boss. So some of this might not be best for progression. You're going to kind of have to make that choice based on your group. But this is kind of my favorite choice, I guess I should say, with the 2-target build. There are a couple different audibles here. If you wanted to go Void Eruption instead, you definitely can. You can even drop N'Zoth and go Mind Devour Yogg-Saron with Mindseer and kind of use those Mind Devour procs on Mindseer for that 2-target damage. But this is very standard Devouring Plague as your spender here, running Yasharj and N'Zoth. Now, in terms of playstyle, not too terribly different. Again, you generally would fill with Mind Spike in this build, although you're going to have so many procs and things to press, not really going to be something you do very often. You do have a kind of a choice here. You can run Insidious Ire, or you can run Malediction for this. So yeah, definitely have some choices. I would say if you're looking for something that is more boss damage and not that kind of too targety stuff, I think the choice that I would kind of flip here is this, and go the Yogg-Saron route instead. And I would even potentially drop my Silence here and get Mind Seer instead. There is some kicks on Kurog, but not enough to where I think you need to have it as a ranged. So these are kind of your options. I think Mythic, I like something like this, going with that kind of Dark Ascension style with N'Zoth. I play with both Ire and Malediction. I think both are good, but kind of do whatever you think is best. I went Ire here just because of that last phase damage. I'm less interested in that kind of Void Torrenty Cleave, and Ire is slightly more pure single target than Malediction is. So yeah, that's Kurog in a nutshell. And really, guys, that covers my rating builds. So let's move on to Mythic Plus. All right, let's talk about Mythic Plus. So this has the kind of most wide sweeping changes to 10.05 that we saw before. The biggest one being we no longer run Mindbender Yasharj, generally speaking, inside of Mythic Plus. Not really something I would suggest. The kind of caveat there is if you're in kind of like a heavy Court of Stars key and you do want more single target, it is an option for you to take, although not something I would recommend for most kind of overall key damage. I generally don't use it anymore, which is kind of why you see these kind of suggested builds. So the first one I'll talk about is the kind of generic standard build. You can run this for virtually any key affix group setup. Is Idol of Cthulhu with Yogg-Saron. You get Mindflay Insanity, you get Void Torrent. You can run this build with Void Eruption. You can also run it with Dark Ascension. I would say Dark Ascension is more like, hey, I need boss damage, and my damage pattern suits it better. So what that means is, if you're finding yourself pulling kind of one pack out of time, and specifically when you use Void Eruption, the pack is dying and you're not chain pulling before your cooldowns are over. Those are all kind of indications that, okay, maybe Dark Ascension would have been better here. It's just kind of how it lines up with your group and the key. As you start to pull more aggressively with more coordinated groups, you're going to see more value out of Void form. Especially now that Void Bolt cleaves with Psychic Link. The tricky part, again, is lining up a 2-minute cooldown is slightly more difficult than lining up a 1-minute cooldown. The reason why it's only slightly is you still have to sync up Dark Ascension with Power Infusion, which can be a little awkward. And you find as you delay and move cooldowns around, that can be the challenging part with running Dark Ascension if you're not paying attention. Either way, this build kind of in the current talent setup will work either way. Now, some of you might be like, well, okay, but Cthulhu doesn't feel like it's that powerful. Like, what's even the point of going down this space? More or less, it's because of how often you're going to be channeling Mind Seer. Getting that value out of Screams to the Void is actually really big. And yes, Idol of Cthulhu's actual damage output might not look, the greatest on your kind of key overall damage. The thing to keep in mind is the Insanity generation is nothing to slouch at. You're getting almost as much Insanity from Idol of Cthulhu over the course of a key that you do get with Auspicious Spirits. It's actually pretty close. AS usually wins out, but depending on your proc rate, which is one of the big reasons why you want this. So obviously take it with a grain of salt. RPPM effects are always kind of hard to control. But that's the reason we go for this. Now, simply put, to kind of expand on why we don't take Mindbender anymore, the problem is there's no way to fit it in with what we have now. So if you kind of take our base of, you always want Mindflay Insanity for that big single target, Mind Devourer, Yogg-Saron, too good to give up. We definitely want Void Torrent. So now the problem is, well, what do you do to go down to get Mindbender? Well, you can do that, right? But then you don't have an idol. And running one idol build is not good, not recommended, not something I would suggest. So that's the primary reason why you don't see that anymore, is we unfortunately just can't get everything that we want without sacrificing an idol or using an inoptimal idol in the first place. So, and furthermore, they basically kept buffing all of the spells that are not Mindbender melees. Inescapable Torment damage wasn't buffed. They also left Shadow or Death damage by itself, even though they buffed all these other things. So relatively, this was actually kind of nerfed in power, which is kind of the other reason, the side effect. You're not seeing it as much in AoE specifically. We just have better buttons to press. So that's where that is. Now, the alternative build is N'Zoth and Yogg-Saron. So again, Yogg-Saron is kind of that staple just because we want Mind Devourer. Those procs are so good with Mind Seer and AoE. But we could flex the points out of Screams and into Malediction in N'Zoth, or you could even go Ire in N'Zoth. Similar to the Kurog discussion of kind of what you're looking for. Malediction, I think gives you more burst windows, nicer to play with. People have more fun with it, generally speaking. It does, lose to Ire slightly in single target, although it is quite close. Notably, if you do decide to go with Ire, that doesn't change how you spend your Insanity. You still start spending Insanity on Mind Seers starting at 3 targets. There was some stuff we did before where, like, at 3 targets, it was, like, really close, maybe even break even. But Mental Decay always kind of threw that out of the water, generally speaking. So not something I would suggest changing your build over. It's just, not worth it. Now, why would you run this build over the one that I just talked about? So, generally speaking, Cthulhu and Screams of the Void is more of a consistent damage pattern, specifically because of Screams. You're just getting more dot ticks all the time. Now, we are taking Mental Decay, which means in that Cthulhu build, right, you do get that kind of bugged behavior with Mind Flay not working with Shadow Word Pain on single target. Maybe they fix that bug at some point, who knows? That's one of the reasons why that build is not the greatest, but it is just better single target, frankly, than what Malediction or Ire plus N'Zoth can get you. And mostly it's because, like, N'Zoth as a talent is the worst performing of the 4 when it comes to single target. You're looking at like 1 to 2% of your damage, unless you get really lucky, which can happen. All of the other idols, generally speaking, are more than that single target, which is why up to now we haven't really seen it. But with the recent change to adding Void Thrower into Psychic Link, you're seeing this come back into fold because these points are now much more valuable. So when would you run this? When you don't care as much about single target. Now you might be wondering, well, every dungeon has single target, and you're right, which is why this is a little tricky. This is the build I wouldn't suggest running this as kind of your generic build. I think you usually get more out of the Cthulhu, but it's still competitive regardless. If you want to try it out, have fun with it. Specifically, the dungeons I like this in are Knockhood and Ruby Life Pools. The reason why I like it in those dungeons, if you kind of think about those bosses have a generically more 2-target plus on the bosses than other keys. So if we look at Knockhood, the first boss has that ad coming in, not a whole lot there, not too much to think about. Second boss is single target, nothing to write home about. The third boss is just pure 2-target, and that's where N'Zoth does start to get better. It's a 2-target boss. N'Zoth is just better than Cthulhu generally. Now, the last boss, you have that ad phase where you do get that kind of like 4-target cleave, can be okay, but generally not the best. So it's kind of one of those things where you do get decent amount of value out of it because of that. The other thing with N'Zoth is you want to be pulling at least 4 targets with just about every pull that you're doing, and that happens, generally speaking, in every single pull in Knockhood that's not bosses is at least 4 targets, so you're getting kind of full value out of the talent. So definitely good in Knockhood, especially with kind of Malediction giving you that 30-second burst. Quite nice, actually. Ruby Life Pools, similar discussion. First boss has a lot of ads that can be used to proc N'Zoth on death. Second boss has a decent amount of 2-target, depending on how you're tanking the boss. Third, the kind of last boss of the key, doesn't really have too much going on to it. It depends on how the boss is kind of tanked, but there's a sizable amount of 2-target in that fight as well. So because of that, N'Zoth is pretty solid. And again, a lot of the pulls that you're doing, you're usually pulling 4 targets at a time. There's like 1 or 2, I think, where you don't. So it gets a good chunk of value out of that key as well. So I would say my suggestion, Knockhood, Ruby Life Pools, try out N'Zoth. Otherwise, I would try the kind of standard Cthulhu Yogg build, generally speaking. Now, there are a couple of audibles that you can make here. Again, like I said, you can run Dark Ascension with both. If you decide, hey, I actually really want Mental Fortitude, it's a really tough key, or I want Psychic Horror or the Silence Reduction, unfortunately, you do have to give up damage to pick those. The way that I would suggest doing that is to drop 1 point from Dark Evangelism to talent into whatever that is that you wanted. That's the kind of most point efficient thing to do without losing too much damage. Again, it's not a great solution, but if you want it, that's where that is. So, okay, and that pretty much covers the spec tree and kind of those paths. Like I mentioned before, in the description, there's kind of a GitHub link with all the kind of relevant talent builds with some other combinations I didn't mention in this video. Feel free to browse those and see kind of what those are. The nice part about those I will continue to update those as the expansion goes on. So while this video is specific to 10.05 and kind of right now, things obviously are, could still change with future patches, whatever. Those links should be updated. Discord will be updated. Icy Veins is updated, all that good stuff. Before I close out the video, I do want to cover briefly the class tree. So let's talk about that. Alright, so before I close out, the class tree. So I didn't mention this in any of the other builds, and you could probably see some of this stuff changing. For the most part, our class tree is actually pretty standard and pretty set in stone. There's not a whole lot to change kind of from like build to build. I'll kind of just reset the left tree here so I can kind of show you. So when you're crafting a build for the class tree, there are some kind of standard stuff that I think you will always take. So Death and Madness, generally speaking, you're always going to take. If the fight has ads, you get good value out of this. If it doesn't, you could consider dropping it, but Dispel Magic, I always take just to be able to get improved Flash Shield and specifically Protective Light. The kind of DR value of this on Flash Shield stacking multiplicatively, man, hard to say that, with the Fade talent below is nice to have. I always pick up Angelic Feather here. Leap of Faith is always nice to have. Kind of start with our baseline movement. And now to kind of prepare ourselves for the kind of the next section, I always take Dominate Mind because I want to pick up Vampiric Embrace and I need something to get down there, and I generally never pick these guys. Although Void Tendrils, has some, I don't know, niche use cases, maybe with Spiteful or whatever. And then from here, a lot of this comes down to preference and what you need for that given scenario. Shackle Undead, very specific. There's not a whole lot of things this is good for. Halls of Valor, those kind of mini boss ads are nice with this. That's like the major example I can think of. In keys, nothing really in raid sticks out. Purified Disease, something to take for certain keys like Shadow Moon, but again, not a very like common thing that you're gonna need to take all the time. So when you're not taking that, Phantasm, this is a great kind of generic point to have. You actually be surprised at how often you can use this. There's a lot of fun things like this makes Senarth much easier. This makes things like there's a couple bosses where like having the snare removal. I think last boss of Azure Vaults, you can remove that slow stack. That's good as well. You can also choose to do the Psychic Scream cooldown reduction, and effectively you use Scream as like an AoE interrupt more or less. Petrifying Scream, not really useful. I've seen people talk about this, but having them tremble in fear doesn't really do anything. Like, they're not running away, sure, but it gets broken almost immediately all the time anyway. You're not getting a whole lot of value to this. I think voice is just better in every way, but I usually default with Phantasm and pick up that when I need it. So now coming down here, always pick Power Infusion Twins, Twist of Fate. Always pick Vamp Embrace. The leech talent is definitely not as good. 3 or 5% leech with Sand Lane compared to Vamp Embrace now that it's off the global. Makes no sense why you would ever take it. And then we always come down here. Now from here, again, some couple other choices. I usually take Body and Soul and Tithe Evasion, although not strictly required. Just kind of things I usually do. And then some more choices to be able to get down here. Do you need Mass Dispel? I say this is one of the things that we see quite often as like popping up as being useful as a Shadow Priest. There are quite a few keys where this is great, like first boss of Court of Stars or last boss in Temple of the Jade Serpent. There are a couple of raid fights where this is nice as well. So yeah, I would say depending on the fight, take it if you need it. If you don't need Mass Dispel for that key, you have to don't take it. You can get Psychic Voice up here. You can even talent into Void Shield if you want. This is quite small, but it is something. So yeah, you have some options here. Another kind of really crazy audible, depending on what you're doing, is you can actually pick up Spell Warding, which just reduces magic damage taken by 3%. If you don't need Mass Dispel, you don't need Shackle, you don't need Disease Dispel, again, pretty specific, you can come down here and do that. Get that 3% magic DR. It's very specific, doesn't happen very often, but like for things like Taros or whatever, it's useful. I usually do that guy, and then I'll come down here and do Void Shield. And then for this part, pretty set in stone, always full target into mind games for everything. I always take Halo, I just don't like playing with Divine Star. And then from here, I usually go Translucent Image and the Fade cooldown reduction, and then pick up maybe Light's Inspiration, Angelic Bulwark. Now, Angelic Bulwark, not the greatest. You can put this point elsewhere if you want it, but that's kind of where I'd leave it because it's easy to get to. This is kind of my standard kind of class tree build. You can, obviously, there's a lot of expression here from like you have to take this from damage perspective. There's not that many things in here. The other audible that I would say that you can also do, if I remove some talents here that I wasn't super invested in, you can also come down here instead and get Power Word Life, and do something like this. That 1 point can kind of go wherever you want. Power Life is a very powerful utility spell, especially on like tyrannical weeks or when you know people are just getting just decimated with damage. It can actually be pretty nice, or even as a personal defensive for yourself. So I say consider using it. You do have to be kind of, keep in mind, like, you have to show things on your kind of party frame as well, but it can be a nice thing to add to your group for sure. So, and that is kind of my standard class tree. So there you go. Okay, so hopefully that covers everything about talents in 10.05, or at least the kind of the baseline information. If you want kind of more detail about why I did what I did or how I picked what I picked, there's a bunch of resources in the description I would suggest you check out. The Icy Veins guide kind of goes in more depth of kind of why I path certain ways on these builds, or kind of how we've developed them with the various sims that we run, both for raids and Mythic Plus. So check those out if you're interested. Hopefully this has been helpful nonetheless. Thank you so much for watching. Big thanks to the patrons and the YouTube members supporting me. It means a lot, guys. Really appreciate it. I will try to do my best to get kind of videos out. It's going to be kind of sparse as I'm just really busy and kind of more or less recovering from the amount that I've been working on stuff to get ready for this patch. Hopefully this helps. Let me know what you want to see next, the kind of most importance. Do we want to do kind of raid guides, Mythic Plus guides? I'm kind of open to whatever, just kind of whatever you guys are really interested in. So I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.